I'll start off by just briefly giving a little bit of my background. I grew up here in Chicago in the Belmont Cragen neighborhood, 1 block away from the Austin community. So I grew up right on the border of a brown and Black community for most of my life. I did, bounce around the city of Chicago quite frequently. And I grew up in a family that was already close to being second generation gang related here in Chicago. So the background that I come from really focuses on that understanding of the issues within the Black and brown communities, especially issues revolving around gang and violence, since that was the background that I grew up in. I will say that although personally, I don't really use the term Latino or Latinx or Hispanic, just because I feel like those terms really were terms that really don't identify us. They also strip us of our identity and connection to the Americas, and whether it's Central America, North America, or South America, and also the Caribbean islands. So being Mexican and Puerto Rican, I really try to focus on my indigenous roots. But I know that living here in the United States, there are some complex issues regarding race and identity within all of these communities that we talk about. So I know for purposes when I have to fill out surveys and identify race, I will still have to use the Latino, Latinx gender, or not gender, race and ethnicity, but then I will identify as Black because I do not and cannot identify as being Latino white, because I am not white passing, especially during the summer when I get a little darker. My features are more indigenous. So I have never had the ability to present or had that ability to be treated as a white passing person within any of the communities that I've been in. And that includes in school situations and, personal life and jobs and things like that. So with that, I do check the box after selecting Latino or Hispanic as identifying as Black, in solidarity as well with the communities that I primarily work in. So that's a little bit of background on that. I also started off this whole journey of social justice as an artist, probably about 2016, 2017, I started getting back into art. And with that art, I was really using it to find a way to alleviate some of the traumas that I was witnessing day in and day out with police brutality, with drug and substance abuse within my community, with violence within my community. And as we continue on the spectrum, we start to get into, the political aspect of certain politicians that were running for office of president that really sparked a lot of racism to actually start to show itself again. And so my art really started to focus on that. But one thing that I was realizing as I got into art was there is a lot within the brown community, or the Latinx or Latino community, if we want to use either of those terms, that, had a big intersection with struggles in the Black community. But they typically get overlooked or do not get mentioned at all. Most of the people that I grew up with were either Black or Afro-Latino or Latinx as well. And so we started talking about these issues. Police brutality is a key issue in both communities, but yet for every 10 to 15 people within the brown community that are murdered by police, we may get one that gets local coverage to a point where, you know, the name becomes recognizable. So we'll have on the local end, maybe someone like Anthony Alvarez, who was just murdered by police a couple of years ago, actually a couple of days after Adam Toledo. But then we also look at someone like Adam Toledo, who actually made national coverage for a short period of time. But then that attention that is given typically fades away pretty quick, typically quicker than any other community right now. And so my art really started to focus on that, and that's what actually ended up leading me back into looking into politics and movements like the Black Panthers, the Brown Berets, and then I stumbled across the Young Lords. And when I say I stumbled across them, I knew about the Young Lords. Unfortunately, a lot of the stuff that you learn about the Young Lords organization really focuses more on the Young Lords Party in New York. But as you dig deeper, you realize that the Young Lords organization actually started in Lincoln Park in '68. So it was when Lincoln Park actually had a Latino community, a Puerto Rican community at that, that was eventually moved by Mayor Daley's plan of urban renewal. The McCormick Theological Center and also DePaul played a role in that displacement of the community. And so when you start to look at that, you realize, you know, the role that an organization like that meant. And I was just fortunate enough to be around the time that they were actually bringing back that organization under our national chairman, Subi Toro, who created the New Era Young Lords, and that New Era Young Lords was picking up the mantle of where the Young Lords kind of worked. But then, you know, it's been 54 years, and so there was not a lot of recognition going on. And not, you know, a lot of the elders are in their 70s. So, you know, doing the hands-on, boots on the ground work was not something that was really being done. So the new era came, and I noticed their politics and decided to get involved. What ended up happening was I ended up interviewing with some of the original members, including one of the original 7 members of the Young Lords, who's David Rivera. He was the field marshal and still is the field marshal of the Young Lords organization. In that interview, I decided to take the post of deputy chairman here in Illinois. So with that comes the legacy of being one of the original groups that was part of the Rainbow Coalition under Fred Hampton Sr., so Chairman Fred Hampton Sr., before his assassination by the Chicago police. That legacy then brought me back into working with both communities. Although I have always, my art was working in those communities, being part of the original Rainbow Coalition, being part of the Young Lords. The first month and a half, I actually had to sit down with Chairman Fred Hampton Jr. of the Black Panther Cubs, so Chairman Fred's surviving son. And we sat down and we really started planning and working on these points of solidarity between the two communities. Although my organization is primarily an organization that believes in the independence of Puerto Rico, we are opened and opened our doors to anybody of any ethnicity, any gender, any sexual orientation to join. And with that, we started to bring in a lot of members. Actually, my chapter is probably about 50% Black, and then the other 50% Latino or Latinx or Afro-Latino. So that became a starting point for me, because I started looking at the ways that our communities really worked. So currently we do work in Humboldt Park, Little Village, Pilsen, but we also have programs that we're running in Lawndale, programs that we're running in Inglewood, Ashburn, Gresham, and other areas within both Black and Brown communities. And we really started to see, especially with either my Afro-Latino comrades or the comrades that are identified as Black, these points that started to come up, talking points that would always come up for them about leadership. So we look back at some of these social movements and groups that we work with, where we start to see colorism, even though, especially for a Puerto Rican organization, I know the Puerto Rican community really likes to talk about Puerto Ricans come in all colors, from very light-skinned white to very dark-skinned Black and everything in between. But when we start to look at the leadership of some of these organizations that are either primarily Mexican, South American, Puerto Rican, we start to see this power struggle where the lighter-skinned Latinos typically held bigger positions of power. And it gets even worse if we start to look at gender or sexual orientation, where most of the time, like the chairman positions or the chairperson positions were not given to women or darker skinned comrades within the organizations. And in very, very few situations were they given to somebody that was either LGBTQ or trans or anything else, where they actually held positions on the boards. And so we started to talk about this. I will say that my board is very diverse for the Illinois chapter, with various identifications, gender, race, and everything else. And that became a focus for us, because we knew that we couldn't just be like every other organization that was out there. And we take notes from our original the original organization. So if we look at the Young Lords Party in New York, Felipe Luciano would have been identified as Afro-Latino, and he was one of the prominent figures of the New York Young Lords Party back in the 70s. He was actually their first chairman, and really started to look at how to incorporate this. And so one of my primary focuses right now has been working in both communities, because, like I said, there is that overlap of issues that come up: police brutality, food and access to food, funding for proper schooling, safe neighborhoods, things like that, that are denied to both communities. And the only way to get past all of that is to actually start working in solidarity with each other. So our programs that we run work in both of those communities, bringing both Black and Brown to the table, sitting down. One of the programs that we run is a program called Stick Talk, where we actually talk about identity, we talk about systematic issues, and we primarily focus on how all of that revolves around gun use, whether being a victim of gun violence or a perpetrator of gun violence. How community issues based off of your skin color plays into, the time you're given for a gun charge, the need to carry a gun, and things like that, that a lot of the youth actually face. And, please feel free to jump in with any questions. I know I'm kind of going over some stuff, but I want to try to make this interactive. I know it's 6 o'clock on a Wednesday, so if there's anybody that has any questions, you can put it in the chat, or let April know so we could unmute you and let you ask your question. So we started looking at some of these issues, and we noticed that a lot of the perpetrators of the gun violence in these communities, like Lawndale, which is the one that we started at first, we saw the gun issue as a talking point within these communities to start talking about identity and bringing people from young men and women from the Black community of Lawndale, and we would get a couple from Pilsen and Little Village and Humboldt Park, since they kind of surround that Lawndale area, and have them come into these sessions. And we would do it as an open circle, where everybody had equal say. And the thing that we started to notice is that people were starting to realize that these systematic issues that we're facing are equally distributed within the Black and Brown communities, but not really talked about. And so, so we started to try to build programs on that, try to figure out how to, incorporate this aspect of skin and racial identity into the program, and focusing on the overlap of some of, especially when we look at Puerto Rican nationalists like Pedro Albizu Campos, who would, in all purposes, be Afro-Latino. He did not present as your typical Latino. He did have more African features. And so, and how prominent he was within the nationalist movement within Puerto Rico, how prominent he was as being, someone that actually got to go to Harvard back during times when someone of either African descent or even someone that grew up speaking Spanish and coming from Puerto Rico, being able to go in and study law at Harvard was amazing. We also have Schomburg, who is another prominent member and figure within the Puerto Rican community, but he also was an Afro-Latino and had a ton of overlap into building some of the Black history programs that we see today. And these people, as we start to talk about in these circles, really started to build unity between both Black and Brown communities, but also we started to see a little more sense of pride, especially in the Afro-Latino participants of these organizations and these circles, because now they have someone that looks like them and identifies as them, that is prominent in both communities. Someone that the Black community looks up to because, in the case of Schomburg, building the Black history programs and things like that, but also he was a prominent Puerto Rican. And so he spoke Spanish and identified and had that overlap in both communities, and seeing their interest spark like, oh, wow, I can be both and impact both of my communities. I don't have to just, focus on the issues of the Black community because I look more Black. And so people within the Latino community or Latinx community will not recognize me or, allow me the same access that, someone that looks either more Latino or European Latino will have. And vice versa, there's some that speak more Spanish and have that fluent and very prominent Spanish accent. And so they may not be fully accepted in the Black community because of that accent. And so giving and talking about people within that identify as them and had prominent roles in both communities actually, built up a little more self-esteem for the people that were coming to our circles. And it brought an understanding to the ones that were completely either on the Latinx side or on the Black side of identification, and didn't have any real known overlap, because we know on the Latinx side, we are a very mixed people and a mixed culture. So that can be tricky, but like I said, on paper, I may be checking the Latinx Black boxes on my paperwork, but as far as feeling 100% confident to identify as Afro-Latinx, I don't. And that's just because my features are more indigenous, and so I don't try to take away or represent a community that I don't fully fit into. But I do make sure that as we're talking about points of solidarity, that people understand that we don't have to check, because again, the US is a country built on binary. And we were just talking about this as we were in the before the webinar started, was, the US is really focused on a binary of either you're Black or you're white. Everything in between kind of takes a, not only do you have to identify as whatever it is / American, so like Mexican American, Colombian American, or Latin American, you also have to identify as that. And then on top of that, am I white or am I Black? And because of the systematic power structures, most people will defer to white because they know that that may afford them privilege on paper, even though they may not be able to pass for white in person. Like I cannot pass for a Latinx person on white passing, but I can't pass on Afro passing either. But nonetheless, I'm kind of stuck somewhere in the middle, and there's no identification for that.
But I also think that that's part of, this identity, as far as Afro-Latinx, is that it is fluid, there's no one particular thing. And in fact, I had meant to put this up earlier. You'd mentioned colorism, and just so that we are all sharing the same language, I'm just gonna, for the purposes of this webinar, I'm just going to kind of share the definition that we're looking at for this particular webinar. So when we're talking about colorism, do I not have this? When we're talking about colorism, we are talking about a form of racial discrimination based on the shade of an individual's skin tone, typically favoring those lighter skin and directing mistreatment or exclusion of those with darker skin. And here's the thing about it, is that colorism can occur both within a racial or ethnic group. So there's colorism within the African American community, there's colorism within the Latino, Latinx community, within Asian communities. So it's not just directed from the predominant society. So it's not just coming from the white society, it is actually practiced within our own community. So I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page when we talk about colorism.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. Just wanted to hit on that. And when we talk about like Afro-Latinos, there's about 2% US adult population. So it is a small group, but it's actually growing because more people are feeling empowered to identify as Afro-Latinx. I don't know that this was necessarily a big trend a generation ago or 2 generations ago. Like Paul was saying, there's more privilege in being able to check that box as, you're white. So a lot of times it was, I'm Latino or I'm Latinx, and then that was it. There was not necessarily a focus on Black or being something other, because those who had the lighter complexions, there's in our society this built-in implicit bias where the lighter you are, the lighter if you have those European centric features, then it's just more privilege that goes along with that. So it's very interesting that there is a movement now to be more prideful, to kind of like push that identity forward and to embrace that part of identity. So I will stop sharing my screen now.
And I'm glad you bring that up because I was born in the 80s, so I think I was right at the cusp of hospitals marking Latinos as white, like Latino Caucasian. I know my grandmother is probably about 2 shades darker than I am right now, and her birth certificate still says Latino Caucasian, and so does my mom's. When I was born, I was right at the cusp where a lot of hospitals stopped doing that, and so it again, that brings that identity back full circle, because my grandmother would not have been able to pass, and still will not be able to pass as being Caucasian in any sense or shape, but yet, for birth record reasons, she was identified as Latino Caucasian. And again, that's something that, even within family histories, when we look at, interactions within Latino communities, we tend to use pet names in those communities for family members that may either be very white passing or very black passing. And that's something that, I try to talk about and build understanding that those terms, even though, they try to say them with all, cuteness or, love and care, are actually degrading and continue to build this divide within the community. I will say that I grew up not speaking Spanish, so this was one of the conversations that April and I had when I talked about this webinar. I grew up, like I said, on the cusp of the merging Latino community, because Belmont Cragen was not really Latino when I first, in the 80s, not until maybe late 90s, early 2000s did it start to really become a prominent Latino community. So I grew up on that side. My grandmother actually grew up in an orphanage and was forced to learn English only, which then carried over to my mom and myself not being able to speak Spanish. And so when we look at identity, that builds in even more, because not only are we looking at identity as someone that would be Latinx, but one of the characteristics of being accepted as being Latinx is the ability to speak Spanish in a lot of these communities. And I have been told time and time again, that I'm not Latinx or I'm not true Mexican or Puerto Rican because I don't speak Spanish. And so when you tie that with skin color and have somebody that is Afro-Latino that does not speak Spanish, it makes their ability to blend into the Latinx community even harder, because that one concept that could be their saving grace to a lot of people speaking Spanish is not there. And so it's interesting to watch how they have to overcompensate to prove their Latinx-ish characters, and that's something that really gets offensive in many aspects, but it's one of the issues that plagues our community. So that I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something that I struggle with my own identity, is the concept of not speaking fluent Spanish or being able to read and write in Spanish, but yet in an organization that believes in the independence of Puerto Rico and that fights for the Latinx community on all kinds of social justice issues, not just issues plaguing Puerto Rico, but all of the Latin American nations. So
I'm just going to jump in really quickly. There was a comment that you sound like a white girl talks about colorism. And it's, thank you. It's such an important conversation about the Afro-Latinx identity. So thank you for that comment. But yeah, Paul and I had talked about this earlier, how this idea of speaking the language, and if you're not fluent or you don't speak the language, then you're perceived as less so. For me personally, I have a daughter who identifies as Afro-Latinx, and she's little. She does not speak Spanish. She's learning. And so we have that part of her family that doesn't necessarily see her as, Latinx. They see her as she's Black. So that does play into identity, but hopefully we can come to a place where there's a space for everyone under this umbrella. And to a degree, it is a disservice because you're taking so many identities and basically throwing them under the umbrella of Afro-Latinx. And what does that mean? So it's a lot to like condense under this one very large umbrella of identity. But can you speak a little bit? You did speak a little bit, but how has your observation been of individuals who do not necessarily speak Spanish and having to represent in, as you said, in your situation, the Latinx community or Afro-Latinx community? And is that perception, how do you see the bias within our communities and the bias within the white communities directed towards individuals who identify as Latinx or are perceived as Latinx, but don't necessarily, are not necessarily Spanish speakers?
That's okay. So with that one, when I speak in all three communities, so I will say the community that accepts me the most physically, by physical appearance, mannerisms, and how I talk really is the work that I do in the Black communities. They're more accepting of me not speaking Spanish, but leading an organization that represents Latinos. And I'm more comfortable speaking in those communities because I know the issues and I look at the issues because I grew up on that border area of both of them. A little bit of background on myself on that is, like I said, I come from a gang-related family. So growing up, I had exposure to Black gangs and Latino gangs. Primarily on the Latino gang side, it was the Maniac Disciples, it was the Satan Disciples and the Latin Kings. But because of the community I grew up in, I grew up around a lot of, four corner hustlers, vice lords, and GDs. I will say that when the Cabrini Green Towers were still up, right off of the corner of Halsted and Division, there used to be one of the GD towers that I would actually be accepted into going into. And if you grew up in Chicago during the 90s and 2000s and you knew the issues surrounding Cabrini Green, not a lot of Latino people were allowed in Cabrini because of the way the community was built. So I was afforded those privileges of going in, but then again, based off of mannerisms and how I grew up, I believe if I grew up speaking a little more Spanish and had that gender identity or that racial identity where I could fit in more in like Little Village or Pilsen at the time, Humboldt Park even, in my earlier years, I don't know if I would have had that privilege to go into some of these Black communities and be as accepted as I was. And so the Black community is probably the one where I'm most comfortable speaking in. If I go into like Humboldt Park or especially areas like Little Village, it does get a little trickier for me to navigate, especially, networking and building with groups, because the first thing they want to do is talk to you in Spanish. And I have to explain that, because of family traumas based off of the Catholic Church at the time, forcing my grandmother not to learn Spanish, and then that kind of trickling down to where Spanish was frowned upon in the family because they were, forced to not speak Spanish. And if we remember how orphanages were in the 30s, that there was physical abuse that would happen in those kind of institutions. So it made it harder for me to learn Spanish because nobody in the family spoke Spanish. So when I'm in those communities, I have to navigate a little differently. Most of the time, I'm a little more guarded because I do get a lot of people that are like, "Oh, how can you talk and represent our people if you don't speak Spanish?" And the way I've gotten around that is I tend to study our culture, our history, the narrative around what our heroes would have been. So, really focusing in on the issues at hand. So means a lot of extra reading on my behalf, but to be able to break down some of these issues and show them, okay, I may not speak Spanish, but I know what being Mexican or being Puerto Rican is, because I could tell you our history from things that, not everybody will be able to know, because most of the time we're not taught these true histories in school, especially in the case of Puerto Rico, we're not taught about, Schomburg and Pedro Albizu Campos, Lolita LeBron, any of our heroes that would have been people that we should have known about. We're not taught about them. So I'm making my point to know the history so that when I do get faced with that issue of, oh, well, you can't speak Spanish, so how are you going to talk, about what our community needs? I don't need to speak Spanish to know that we're still suffering police brutality, and then on top of that, it's an invisible brutality that we're facing, because most of the time, if we're lucky, maybe one of the Spanish-speaking networks will pick up the case, but most of the time we're not going to talk about it. I don't need to speak Spanish to understand what a food desert is in my community, or to understand that our schools lack resources that they need. And so once I start talking, like explaining that to them, it does make it easier, but it definitely becomes a tricky situation to navigate. And, it becomes even worse for any of my members that may not also speak Spanish. So we have a couple of them that are very fluent, and then there's some that aren't. And then, we actually have one in one of our other chapters that passes as Afro-Latinx down to the skin, and is accepted in the Black community more, but then they speak better Spanish than most Spanish-speaking people in our community. And it's just like, oh, and so they deal with it on a different level, especially because they were out in Florida. So, once you add in your environment, it becomes even trickier. But there was one thing that I did want to talk about, because it's really what started my whole journey in this. Was, like I said, I started in art. And so one of the things, there was a report that I was working on an art project. And on that art project, I was listing the names of the notable names within the Black community of people that were killed by police. And then I was like, okay, what about the Latinx community? And so it took a lot more digging to find actual names, and it led me down many other rabbit holes that, go beyond just police. It goes Border Patrol, and it goes ICE and other organizations that maybe the Black community doesn't have to face, and are excluded off of that police violence report. So when we start to add in all these other organizations that may kill Latinx people, our numbers for police brutality and people murdered by police increase. So there was an article that came out May 2021, because I was talking with April about this, and it made me, I went back to look at it. It was Undios US, which is a non-for-profit organization that does civil rights work for the Latinx community. And they had this report about police and law enforcement and people that are killed based, that are people of color. And they had some statistics. And so like one of the years, it was maybe like 300 people that were Latino or Latinx that were killed. And in the Black community, we're looking at about 521 people. In the white community, we're looking at about 930 people that identified as white. And excuse me. And so I was like, wow, that's a really big difference between the communities. But when I started to dig into it, they have a caveat in it that says that depending on how you identified, or how the police officer that shot you identifies you in the report, is how you originally get on that database. So if you were Latinx but you were Afro-Latino or Afro-Latinx, you would end up being identified as Black on the police incident report of the shooting. Not until they go back and they look at the coroner report and the birth certificate do those numbers change. And I found that really interesting. And so they have a report up, and if anybody wants it, I'll send it to April. And when they look at it, they start looking at the aggregated numbers. So when we look at, let's see, 2019 was the year that I was talking about. So we were originally looking at 276 people, Latino, Latinx, 536 in the Black category, and 819 in the white. We then go to 2019 after they do the aggregated, and it goes up to 342 in the Latino community, 465 in the Black, and 729 in the white. And those aggregated numbers then start to show a closer similarity between the Black and brown community of people murdered by the police. And so that really started to get me thinking, is like, if our numbers are not that different, why are we not talking about these issues a little more? And that's where, this identity and skin, this colorism that we just talked about, really comes into play. So it's almost like for our community, we won't get that representation because of the fact that, depending on how we present is what we get classified in. And it's not based off of our own identity, it's the box that other people put us into. So society has deemed, especially here in the US, it's either you're Black or you're white. And like I said, everybody else in between, you have to pick a side regardless. We could be Latinx, but we still have to pick, are we Latinx Black? Are we Latinx white? And I think we even get like Native American in that, I think they opened it up to 3 different things that we could choose now. But it is something of an issue that still needs to be explored a little more. And we need more topics on this, and we need to start questioning the data that we see coming out of reports, and questioning why certain topics are presented in certain ways. Because when we look at police violence and unarmed citizens being murdered by police, we automatically are told that that's a Black community only issue, and it's not. When we look at, say, immigration issues. We saw just a couple years ago Haitians being rounded up at the border and treated as if, you know, we were back in some 1800s, you know, slave master plantation treatment, you know, people on horses rounding them up. And it's, you know, these issues, that immigration issue would only get pushed as if it was an immigration issue facing the Latino community. And so we really need to start looking and questioning the way things are presented to us, and also, you know, trying to be more understanding and inclusive in the way we build our social structures, the way we talk about things, the way we build our movements, because there is a lot of overlap that we need to look at. And that solidarity and that understanding in both communities, and showing that you can be a Latino and still have an impact on the Black community, and vice versa. You could still be Black and have a huge impact on the Latino community. I mean, Chairman Fred Hampton Sr. was a perfect example of that. The program, when he built the Rainbow Coalition and started talking to, you know, poor whites and the Latino community and the Black community, and getting us together, that was powerful. But we need to extend that even into the street tribes, and that's where my research comes in, is how do we take that and also educate the, you know, street tribes, the gang members, and show them that you're fighting the wrong oppressor. You know, you're looking at someone in the Latino community or even within your own community as your enemy, when there's issues and systematic structures that are the same, and that's what's keeping us down. It's not, you know, it's not the person down the street that's in the Black community, or the person down the street that's in the Latino community that's keeping you down. It's these structures that both of our communities face, and how do we move past that?
And that's a really good point. One of the last things that I wanted to hit on was, like, how do we create this atmosphere of inclusivity, a space for everyone? And I just really quickly, if I wanted to share a quote by Soledad O'Brien. "I'm Black, I'm Latina. My mom is Cuban, Afro-Cuban. My dad is white and Australian. And I think because of my job, often a question like, how do you identify, is really not about the question. It's always, what side are you on? What perspective do you bring?" And I just, I wanted to share that because, you know, it's important, because we are here, our struggles are the same, and there are individuals who identify as both and could helpfully, like, help us bridge that divide, and work together and be more allies. But Paul, did you have any words on how we could work together to create a space? I know a lot of what you said earlier was just recognizing that we do have some of the same struggles.
Yeah, the biggest success that I've had in doing that is actually bringing together community circles, where, you know, there's no head of the table. We all sit, and it's similarly based off of, you know, indigenous practices of sharing sacred space in circles with each other. And so we do that very often. We do that once a week out in Humboldt Park, out in Lawndale. We have one of my members who is a board member. He actually is in Ashburn Gresham, and he holds that same circle out there. And we really make it, and it becomes difficult because we are dealing with youth and guns and things like that. But showing them that there is a connection between our communities, and building that connection, showing powerful leaders like Fred Hampton that stood together, showing Schomburg or Pedro Albizu Campos, or, you know, anybody else that can bridge between both communities and show this different side of solidarity that most people and most institutions will not show us. So not until we really start, explaining these struggles, like conversations I had with people about, how Mexico actually fought the US and we're protecting slaves that actually made it across into the Mexican border. I use that as an example, but, we also face a lot of colorism based off of European standards that Spain brought over, where the indigenous people are still, indigenous and Black Mexicans are treated as second-class citizens within Mexico itself. So when I give an example, I'm not giving an example to say, hey, Mexico has it all figured out or some other country does, because each country still has that European mindset of, light skin is better, the darker the skin, the more untrustworthy a person is, or whatever, however they demonize people and make them subhuman in the eyes of, let's call it what it is, really white supremacist mindset. And unfortunately, because of colonization, that white supremacist mindset is so rampant and all over the world. We have people in many countries bleaching their skin to be more white passing, and the damage that they're doing to their body and it is astounding, and so we have to understand and accept these things and teach these things, so that people could actually really start to see what's really going on.
Thank you so much. Exactly. I just want to encourage anyone, we are right at the 7 o'clock, coming up right on 7 o'clock. If anyone had any last questions, you could feel free to raise your hand. I can unmute you, or you can put that in the chat box. No. Otherwise, I want to thank so much, Paul, for joining us and leading this conversation. I also want to let everyone else know that we're going to continue these conversations. We do have a webinar scheduled for the winter quarter on continuing this topic on colorism and colorism in communities of color, and kind of working towards creating a more inclusive environment and being allies and showing up for each other. So thank you guys so much for joining us. It doesn't look like we have any other questions. Thank you and have a good night.